The wolf's rage had started in midsummer. That was what the kitchen staff called it, simply the wolf. Not the Alpha King's warhound, not the creature bound by old rights to the bloodline of the throne, just the wolf, said in the same tone you'd use for a sickness spreading through the lower quarters. Something to be acknowledged in low voices and then set aside. Because what could anyone in the kitchens do about it anyway? Willa had heard the accounts the way she heard most things, in pieces, through the gaps between other people's conversations. The first handler had come back missing 2 fingers. The second hadn't come back at all, though no one would say what that meant directly. The third and fourth had been pulled out of the eastern wing corridor by palace guards, both breathing, both with the look of men who had left something important behind them in that passage and weren't going back for it. 4 handlers in 3 months. The cage remained, the wolf remained. And the Alpha King, by every account that filtered down through the palace's many layers, had refused every suggestion that the animal be put down with the same flat, final quality that ended conversations and started silence. Willa had been cleaning the great hall's fire grates when the head steward found her. His name was Aldous, thin-shouldered, always slightly damp about the forehead, with the particular manner of a man who had managed crises for so long that he'd started to mistake management for resolution. He looked at her the way he looked at all the wolfless staff, as something that occupied space without contributing significance. "The eastern kennels," he said. "You'll take the morning shift. Feed, water, clean the pen." She looked at him directly. "The eastern kennels are closed. They're being reopened. Effective tomorrow. Those are the werewolf's quarters." Yes, there was nothing else. No explanation of what had changed. No acknowledgement of what 4 previous handlers had experienced. He wrote something in his ledger, told her the hour she was expected, and walked away. The message was clean and simple, in the way that only messages delivered to people considered replaceable can be. If the wolf injured her, it would be unfortunate and no one's problem. Willa stood in the hall with her cleaning rag still in her hand for a long moment after he left. Then she went back to the grates. She arrived at the eastern passage before the sun had fully cleared the outer wall. The air in that part of the palace had a different quality from the rest. Older, somehow, the stone darker and the corridors narrower, as though this wing had been built in a different age with different intentions. Torches burned in the brackets, but did little more than make the shadows visible. She carried her own lamp. The door to the outer pen was iron-banded oak, heavy enough that she had to lean into it with her shoulder. It opened onto a space larger than she had anticipated. Not a simple kennel, but a proper enclosure, high-walled, with a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow above. The stone floor was scored with long parallel marks that could only have been made by claws. The feeding trough along the far wall had been overturned and not righted. The iron gate dividing the space from the inner den was bolted in 3 places. The wolf was at the back. She saw him before she fully processed what she was seeing, and by the time her mind caught up, she had already stopped moving. He was enormous. That was the word that arrived first and crowded out everything else. Enormous. She had heard descriptions, the kitchen staff, the stable hands, even one of the palace guards who had spoken too freely over his 3rd cup of wine. But descriptions had apparently been insufficient preparation for the reality of him. He stood on 4 limbs that looked built for ending things, his shoulders at the height of her chest, his coat a black so complete it seemed to pull light toward itself. Along the edges of that black, just visible in the lamplight, the fur ended in silver. Not gray, not pale, but a true silver, like metal caught in moonlight. His head came up when she entered. The sound that followed began below hearing. She felt it in her back teeth and in the base of her sternum before it became audible, rising like water through a sealed pipe until it filled the enclosure entirely. A growl with no specific point of origin because it was everywhere at once. She felt it pressing against her skin. Her feet had stopped. She was aware of that in a distant way, the way you're aware of your own heartbeat only when something makes it very loud. The wolf crossed the enclosure in 4 strides. She didn't run. Later, she wouldn't be entirely able to explain why. Some part of her brain had apparently performed a calculation in the half-second available and arrived at the conclusion that running was useless, which was true, and that stillness was the only variable she controlled, which was also true. She stood with the lamp in her right hand and the feed bucket in her left, and she did not move. He hit the iron gate at full speed. The gate held. The sound of the impact rang off the stone walls and came back doubled. The wolf reared back, hit it again, and this time the whole gate assembly shuddered in its frame. Willa took one step backward, just one. Her heel found the wall behind her, and she stopped there, pressed against it, watching. He paced, back and forth along the gate, that continuous low sound rolling out of him, his silver-edged gaze tracking her with a focus that felt less like an animal assessing prey and more like something trying very hard to solve a problem. She watched him pace. After a while, she set the feed bucket down, slowly, without sudden movement. She crouched and opened it and began to prepare the feeding the way the steward's written instructions described, portioning the raw meat onto the iron plate that was designed to slide under the gate's lower clearance. The wolf stopped pacing. She kept her hands moving. The meat went onto the plate. She slid it forward inch by inch until it reached the gate's edge. He was watching her hands, not the meat. Her hands. She pushed the plate through the gap and drew her fingers back and sat on her heels. The wolf came to the gate. He was close enough now that she could see the detail of him. The weight behind his eyes, which were silver pale and burning with something she had no immediate name for, and the way his enormous chest moved with each slow breath, and the particular stillness that had replaced the pacing. Not the stillness of a predator deciding. Something older than that, and harder to categorize. He lowered his head. His nose came through the gap between the gate and the stone floor, the muzzle too large to fit more than the tip, but enough. He pressed it forward, toward her hand, which was still close to the gate because she hadn't moved it yet. She should have moved it. She didn't. His tongue came out. It was a single slow movement, unhurried and deliberate, and it crossed the back of her hand from knuckle to wrist. She felt the warmth of it travel all the way up her arm. The growl had stopped. The enclosure was completely silent except for her own breathing, which she was only now aware had been coming very fast. The wolf drew back. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he lowered his head to the iron plate and began to eat. Willa sat on the stone floor and concentrated on breathing at a measured rate. She finished the rest of her tasks, righting the overturned trough, distributing water, collecting what could be collected through the gate's lower clearance, with the wolf watching her from across the enclosure. He didn't approach the gate again. He didn't make the sound either. By the time she gathered her things and moved toward the outer door, he had settled onto the floor with his enormous head on his forepaws, his eyes still open and still tracking her, but with a quality she could only describe as patience. She didn't know what to do with that observation, so she set it aside. She let herself out and pulled the iron-banded door shut behind her and stood in the corridor for a moment, with her back against the wood. Then she picked up her lamp and went to start the rest of her morning. She did not see him on her way out. She didn't know the passage above the eastern enclosure existed. A narrow walkway cut into the upper wall, barely wide enough for a single person, accessible through a door that appeared on no map she'd ever had reason to consult. She didn't know someone had been standing there since before she arrived, watching through the iron grate set into the walkway floor. Gideon had come to that passage every night for 3 months. He hadn't told Corin. He hadn't told anyone. He came after the evening council sessions ended and the palace quieted around him, and he climbed the service stair to the upper passage, and he stood in the dark above the enclosure, and he watched Vielle, who had not slept more than a few hours at any stretch since midsummer, who paced and destroyed and produced that sound that Gideon felt resonating inside his own ribcage because of what bound them. It was an old thing, the binding. Older than Gideon's reign, older than his father's, older than the current palace stones. The war-wolf of the Alpha King's bloodline was not a pet and not a weapon and not simply an animal. He was the living form of something ancestral, the instinct of the bloodline made flesh, tethered to the Alpha King by a connection that moved in both directions. What Vale felt, Gideon felt a version of in his own body. Joy, rarely. Alertness often. Rage, for the past 3 months, constantly. 3 months of Vale's distress, bleeding into his own sleep. Waking at odd hours with his pulse running wrong and his hands braced against the mattress, trying to separate his own mind from the animals. He had stopped being able to tell sometimes which restlessness was his. He hadn't been able to explain it. He hadn't been able to stop it. And he hadn't been able to give the order to put Vael down, which the council wanted and which would have ended it. The thought arrived every few weeks, like an accounting he kept refusing to settle, and every time he set it aside and walked out of the council chamber and went back to his work, and nothing changed. He had not expected the girl. He'd been in the passage when she came through the outer door, lamp in hand, bucket in the other. He'd watched Vael cross the enclosure at full speed and hit the gate, and watched her press against the wall behind her and not run. He'd watched her crouch on the stone floor and portion the meat without hesitation, and slide the plate through the gap with the methodical focus of someone who had decided on a course and was seeing it through. He'd watched Vael stop, and then he'd watched the moment at the gate, the wolf's nose through the gap, the deliberate movement across her hand, with something lodged directly below his sternum that he couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't exactly uncomfortable either. It simply sat there and demanded attention he wasn't prepared to give it. What he knew, standing above her in the passage, was this. Vael had not been still for more than a minute at a stretch in 3 months. Vael had sent 4 people to the healers. Vael had looked at this wolfless kitchen servant with the too small lamp and the calloused hands, and he had decided, with whatever passed for consideration in a creature that was more than a creature, to be still. After she left, the enclosure went quiet. Vael settled into the corner near the righted trough, with his head on his forepaws and his silver-edged eyes half-closed. His breathing slowed in long, even intervals. The sound that had been a constant presence in the eastern wing for weeks faded and then stopped, and the absence of it was so complete that the silence felt physical. Gideon felt the shift move through his own body at the same moment. Something unclenched in his chest, a pressure he had stopped noticing because it had been constant for so long that its absence was more startling than its presence had ever managed to be. His pulse slowed to something recognizable. His shoulders dropped a fraction from where they'd been braced. He stood in the passage for a long time after she had gone, his forearms resting on the iron grate, looking down at Vael sleeping on the stone floor below. He didn't go down to the enclosure. He didn't send for her. He stood in the dark above the wolf that was bound to his bloodline by something that predated every political arrangement in his life. And he thought about the way she had sat on the floor without hesitation, and the way Vael had looked at her. He turned it over carefully, the way you turn over something unfamiliar to examine it from all angles before deciding what it is. Then he went back to his chambers through the service passage, and he lay awake for several hours, and in the morning he said nothing to Corin about what he had witnessed. But by the time the sun was fully up, he knew the name written on the steward's roster for the Eastern Wing morning shift. Willa. He said nothing about that either. He went to his morning council and sat at the head of the long table and listened to reports about the northern border and the grain stores and the cost of replacing the gate hardware in the Eastern Wing for the 3rd time this season. The place in his chest, where Vael's rage had lived for 3 months, was quiet. He noticed that. He kept noticing it, at intervals, throughout the whole of the day. The reassignment happened the morning after. Willa was in the eastern corridor before first light, lamp in hand, when the head steward stopped her near the service passage entrance. He had his ledger with him, as he always did, but he held it differently than usual, the way a man holds something he's been told to carry without being told why. "Your assignment has been changed," Aldous said, without looking directly at her. "Eastern Kennels, permanent morning shift, daily." Willa waited. "That's all," he added, wrote something in the ledger and walked away. No reason was given. No record was handed to her. No written confirmation of the change. Just the verbal instruction, the closed ledger, and his retreating back down the corridor. She had learned across most of her life in palace service that certain instructions came without documentation, and that asking about the reasons behind them was rarely productive. She adjusted the lamp to her other hand and went to the kennels. Vael was awake when she arrived, standing in the center of the enclosure with his large head turned toward the outer door, as though he had heard her coming before she reached it. When she entered, something in his posture shifted. Not aggression, not the coiled readiness she had braced for on the first morning. He turned to face her and stood there while she moved through the space. He watched her the entire time, not with hunger, with attention. She decided not to examine the distinction too closely and got on with the work. The days that followed had a particular rhythm. Before dawn, the eastern wing, the lamp, the outer door that still required a shoulder to open. Vael at the back of the enclosure or near the gate, depending on his mood, always tracking her, never approaching with the violence of the first morning. The feeding, the water, the cleaning. The wolf's silver-edged gaze following her hands with an expression she had stopped trying to describe accurately, because every word she reached for felt insufficient. She began to notice other things. On the third day, she was running late. A collision in the kitchen passage with a full water basin had soaked her apron and required a change. And she arrived at the eastern wing moving faster than usual, her jaw tight with the irritation of it. Vael was pacing when she entered. Not the frantic circuit she'd heard described from the months before, but a deliberate back and forth that seemed to match something in the quality of the air around her. She paused just inside the outer door. He paced. She made herself take 3 slow breaths, and then she moved toward the feed trough, and by the time she reached it, Vael had stopped. She stood still for a moment, looked at him. He looked back. He lay down. On the 5th day, she tested it deliberately. She sat on the stone floor across from the gate and let herself think about nothing in particular. The quality of the lamplight on the scored stone, the sound of wind working through the high vents. Not calm exactly, but a directed stillness. Vael circled once, twice, and then folded himself onto the floor with the unhurried weight of something very large, choosing to rest. She kept that observation entirely to herself. She had learned over a lifetime which things in palace life were better left unspoken, and the discovery that the Alpha King's werewolf appeared to mirror her internal state felt clearly in that category. She wasn't certain what it meant. She wasn't certain she wanted to know yet. What she was increasingly certain of was that she was being watched, not by Vael, though he watched her constantly. Something else. A presence in the eastern wing on mornings when it had no business being occupied. A door at the end of the upper corridor that stood slightly ajar on days she'd previously walked past it closed. Footsteps, one set, unhurried, too heavy for kitchen staff, that she heard once in the passage above and then didn't hear again. The first time she saw him directly was on the 9th day. She was carrying the empty feed bucket out of the enclosure when she looked up and found the Alpha King standing at the far end of the eastern corridor. He wasn't doing anything in particular. He was simply there, his back to the wall and his arms at his sides, watching her with those amber eyes that caught the torchlight in a way that had nothing subtle about it. His dark red beard caught it too, the russet in it more visible in torch flame than it had been in the few large rooms where she'd previously been in his presence without reason to look at him directly. She stopped. He didn't move. Protocol was clear. She had learned court behavior along with everything else across most of her palace life. She lowered her gaze, tucked herself against the wall, waited for him to pass. He didn't pass. He stood at the end of the corridor for a moment longer, and she kept her eyes down and her hands around the bucket handle and heard, eventually, the sound of his footsteps moving away. She went back to the kitchens and spent the rest of the morning declining to follow any thought about it further than its first step. He appeared again on the 11th day, not in the corridor. She found him in the outer courtyard, adjacent to the eastern wing when she exited through the side passage, standing near the wall with Corin, who had been speaking in a low voice that stopped when she came through the door. Gideon didn't stop looking at her when Corin went quiet. She kept walking, head down, rounded the corner of the building, and stood on the other side of it for a moment longer than she needed to before continuing toward the laundry exchange. She was not going to construct meaning out of a man standing in a courtyard. That was the rule she set for herself, and she intended to keep it. The conversation that ended Gideon's carefully maintained silence on the matter happened on the 12th day. Corin had waited until the morning council dismissed, and the other advisors had filed out before he approached the long table where Gideon remained seated, working through the border reports with the concentration of a man determined to appear concentrated. Corin sat down at the nearest chair without being invited, which was one of approximately 4 liberties he permitted himself, earned across 3 decades of service. "I need to speak with you about Vael," Corin said. "I'm aware. You've been aware for 12 days. You've also been finding reasons to be in the eastern wing at hours when no council business requires it. He paused. I'm not raising this to reproach you. There is context you should have, and I've been deciding how to present it. Gideon set down the border report. Then present it. Corin folded his hands on the table. The Warwolf's binding to the bloodline is older than the palace. Most of what is understood about it has come down through the Beta line. Passed between advisors across generations, not written anywhere the council or the historians can access. What the written record carries is that Vial serves the Alpha King's bloodline. What passes between Betas is something more specific. Gideon said nothing. Vial is bound to the instinct of the bloodline, Corin continued. Every Alpha King who has held that binding has described the same experience. The wolf's emotions bleeding into their own, the connection moving in both directions. But the other component, the one that precedes full expression, Vial will recognize the Alpha King's true mate before the Alpha King himself does. And once that recognition occurs, he will accept only her. The room sat quiet for a moment. The 3 months of rage, Gideon said. His voice carried no inflection. The binding knows what the mind hasn't accepted yet. What you are beginning to feel, the awareness of her position, the way her presence registers in your body without effort, that is the bond forming. It is not something that can be reversed once Vial has made his recognition. It doesn't work backward. Gideon stood from the table. The ceremony with Lady Sybil, Corin said carefully, is in 2 months. I know when it is. Gideon. There was something in Corin's voice that wasn't present in council sessions, something without performance, carrying the weight of years rather than argument. The bond between a true mate pair will not. This conversation is finished. He said it without heat, which made it more final than anger would have. He picked up the border report. You've delivered the information. I've received it. Corin didn't argue. He had served 3 Alpha Kings. He knew the difference between resistance that invited further discussion and resistance that had sealed itself shut. He watched Gideon leave the chamber and sat with his folded hands on the table for a moment after the door closed. The door being shut didn't mean it would stay that way. It never did. What Corin withheld, because Gideon needed time to exhaust his own certainty before he could hear the rest, was that in the accumulated memory of 3 Beta lines, no Alpha King had successfully overridden Veil's recognition. Not for duty, not for existing political arrangements, not for any reason that had seemed sufficient from the outside looking in. They had tried. The cost had been paid in the body first, and eventually in everything else. He would let Gideon try. He always let people arrive at the wall themselves, rather than describing it in advance. What Gideon didn't tell Corin, what he held in some interior space that didn't connect to spoken acknowledgement, was that the 12 days had already exacted a cost that had nothing to do with the wolf directly. The awareness had started subtly. On the 2nd day, he had told himself it was the passive territorial tracking that came with his position, an Alpha King's baseline sensitivity to anyone moving through spaces he governed. He had believed this with some confidence for approximately 4 days before it became specific enough that the explanation no longer held its shape. It wasn't general awareness. It was her, not a visual thing. It was more fundamental than sight, a directional pressure, like a compass point that updated itself in real time, tracking her movement through the palace's lower corridors and kitchen passages and service routes without requiring his attention or intention. He knew at most hours the general quarter of the palace she occupied, not because he had arranged to know, because the information arrived on its own and installed itself and declined to be put elsewhere. The physical dimension of it was harder to dismiss. His senses, already acute in the way all shifters carried as ordinary, sharpened further in the way an Alpha King's ran above ordinary, had begun sorting her out of the general texture of the palace's inhabitants with an efficiency he hadn't directed and couldn't redirect. He registered her presence before she was visible. He tracked her movement in adjacent spaces without meaning to. And underneath all of it, the bond forming like pressure in the chest, a low, constant hum that sat exactly where Veil's rage had lived for 3 months, occupying the same space, but with an entirely different quality. On the 11th morning in the courtyard, Corin mid-sentence, the side passage door opening, He had known she was there before she appeared, several seconds before. The pressure of her proximity had shifted, and his body had registered it, and he had kept his face arranged appropriately while she crossed the courtyard with her eyes down and her bucket and disappeared around the corner of the building. Corin had resumed his sentence after a pause of several beats. Neither of them had addressed it. After leaving the council chamber, Gideon walked the outer wall alone. Cold, flat afternoon light. He walked until his pulse returned to something he recognized as his own, and then he stood at the far end of the wall and looked out over the lower grounds with the deliberate blankness of a man performing an accounting. 2 months until the ceremony. The political weight of that arrangement was real and not decorative. Lady Sybil's family held structural influence in the council that had stabilized 3 significant decisions in the past year alone. He had agreed to the match with clear eyes. He had not since found legitimate cause to revisit the reasoning. He had found none. The logic held. Whatever his body was currently producing in response to a wolfless kitchen servant was not, by any standard he could apply from where he stood, a counter-argument. He told himself this in plain terms with the afternoon light on the stones. He told himself the awareness would settle, that it was the bond's early mechanism, a physiological response to Vile's recognition, anchored in the ancient binding, not in anything real. He told himself he had governed more difficult circumstances than this, and had done so without the governing becoming visible. He turned back toward the palace. He did not go to the eastern wing. He went to his chambers and worked through the remaining correspondence, and when he had finished, he wrote a short message to Corin through the private channel they used for communications that didn't pass through the steward's ledger. It said, "The morning assignment in the Eastern Kennels remains unchanged, verbal only. No documentation." He sent it and set down the pen. Corin would understand the instruction. He always understood. What Gideon didn't write, because it required no explanation between them, was the reason behind it. The assignment needed to remain unremarked by the council and by Sybil while he resolved this quietly. 2 months was sufficient time. He would find a way through the logic of it before the ceremony. That night, he didn't go to the passage above the enclosure. He lay in the dark, and the palace settled around him, and somewhere in the eastern wing, Vile slept on the stone floor without disturbance. Gideon felt the absence of the wolf's rage in his own chest, the way you feel the absence of a weight that has been so constant you had stopped noticing its presence, only recognizable now through its removal. He lay awake for a long time. The reason for it was different from the 3 months preceding it, which was not a comfortable thing to acknowledge and not a thing he intended to acknowledge directly. He stared at the ceiling until the torches burned low, and he waited for morning to arrive and give him something he could act on. The document arrived at Aldis's desk on a Tuesday, which was his accounting day, which meant his attention was already divided and his patience was already thin. It was a formal reallocation order, palace letterhead, the council seal pressed cleanly into the wax at the bottom, the signature of Lord Edric, Lady Sybil's father, and the council's senior member, written in the deliberate hand of a man who understood the weight of written records. The language was administrative and precise. It cited an irregularity in the Eastern Wing staffing roster, specifically the undocumented reassignment of a kitchen servant to kennel duties without proper authorization, and directed that the servant in question be returned to her previous assignment pending a formal review of the reallocation process. Aldis read it twice. Then he opened his ledger to the Eastern Wing roster and found exactly what the document described. Willa's reassignment, recorded in his own hand as a verbal instruction passed down from above, with no written authorization attached. He had been meaning to follow up on the documentation. He had not yet done so. He sent a runner to the lower kitchens. Willa received the news the way she received most administrative changes, with her hands still occupied and her face arranged neutrally. She was told she was being moved to the laundry stores in the lower level, effective immediately, pending a staffing review that Aldis could not give her a timeline for. She asked once if the Eastern Kennels shift would be covered in her absence. He told her that was not her concern. She set down what she was carrying, wiped her hands on her apron, and went where she was sent. The laundry stores occupied a section of the palace's lower level that got no direct light. The air there was permanently damp, carrying the particular heaviness of a space where water was always in use and never fully dried. The work was physically demanding in a different way from the kitchens. Less varied, more continuous. Stone basins, heavy linens, water hauled and heated and hauled again. Willa found a rhythm in it within the first hour and worked through the afternoon without speaking to anyone. She did not examine the coincidence of the reassignment's timing too closely. She had made herself that promise, and she intended to hold it. The palace, however, was not interested in her promises. Viel's eruption began before she had been in the laundry stores for 2 hours. She heard it as vibration first, a low resonance that traveled through the stone floor and up through her feet while she was lifting a basin. She paused. The woman working at the adjacent basin paused too, glancing upward as though the ceiling could explain itself. Then the sound became audible. Not precisely a howl, not precisely a roar, but a combination of both that moved through the palace's lower passages with the efficiency of something that had been building pressure for a long time and had finally found a direction to go. Around her, the other laundry workers began moving toward the corridor. The sound continued. It didn't stop. The vibration in the floor changed quality. Something had been struck, forcefully and repeatedly, in the eastern section of the palace. The stone carried it clearly. Another impact, and then a structural sound she couldn't immediately identify. The groan of something large and heavy being tested against its own tolerances. The head of the laundry stores appeared in the doorway and told everyone to stay where they were. Nobody stayed where they were. Willa went back to her basin. She worked through the noise and the departure of the other women and the growing urgency of voices in the corridor outside. She kept her hands in the water and told herself this was not connected to her in any meaningful way, and focused on the task in front of her with the deliberate attention of someone choosing a direction for their thoughts and holding it there by will. The pain hit Gideon in the middle of a document review. It was not gradual. It arrived complete. A pressure in the chest that constricted without warning, a sensation like something fundamental to his internal architecture shifting against its own structure. He was on his feet before he fully understood what his body was responding to, the document scattering from the desk, his hand pressing flat to his sternum as though that would locate the source. Vial. He felt the wolf's distress the way he had felt it for 3 months. But this was different from the sustained low-grade rage that had become background noise across the summer. This was acute, something specific, something wrong in a way that was distinct from the ordinary wrongness of recent months. He was in the corridor before his guard had time to follow. The sound grew clearer as he moved through the palace toward the eastern wing. That layered noise he recognized as vile pushed past the point where instinct and control maintained any negotiation between them. He came through the eastern passage at a pace that scattered 2 junior stewards and a page who had been standing in the corridor trying to identify the source. And when he reached the outer door to the enclosure, he pulled it open without pausing. The scene inside was immediate and total. Viel had hit the iron gate so many times that the lower hinge had pulled partially free from the stone, leaving the whole assembly hanging at a slight angle. The scored marks on the floor that Willa had noted on her first morning had been deepened. The water trough had been displaced again. The wolf himself was at the center of the enclosure with his head low and his chest heaving, producing that sound continuously, his silver-edged gaze moving around the space with the disoriented quality of something looking for what it already knew wasn't there. Gideon stood in the entrance. The pressure in his own chest matched the rhythm of Vial's distress exactly. Not metaphorically, physically, a synchronization that moved in and out with the wolf's visible agitation, the ancient binding making the two of them a single system, whether he wanted that or not. He stayed in the doorway until Vial acknowledged his presence. One slow turn of the enormous head, the burning silver gaze settling on him with something that was not quite relief and not quite accusation, but contained elements of both. "Where is she?" Gideon said. Not a question directed at the wolf. A question that arrived in his own mind and came out his mouth because the connection between them made the answer known. Viel didn't have language, but the bond communicated anyway, in the imprecise but unmistakable way it always did. She was not here. He turned and found his head guard in the passage behind him. The woman assigned to this shift. Where has she been moved? The guard processed the question and produced the answer in less time than Gideon would have tolerated a delay. Lower level, laundry stores, Reassigned this morning on a reallocation order. Gideon looked at him for a moment. Bring me the order. He went to the lower level himself. He did not wait for the document. The laundry stores were quiet when he came through the passage entrance. Most of the workers had drifted toward the corridors when Vale's eruption began, drawn by the same instinct that draws people toward disturbance even when moving toward it is inadvisable. The space was large and low-ceilinged and smelled of hot water and lye, lit by a row of oil lamps that cast the stone basins in amber light. Willa was the only person still at work. She had her back to the entrance, her sleeves pushed to her elbows, her dark hair escaping from its tie in the way it did after several hours of physical work. She was lifting a heavy linen from one basin to another, and she didn't stop when he came in, and she didn't turn immediately. And for a moment he stood in the entrance watching her work in a space she had been sent to without reason given, while the palace above them produced the sound of Vile dismantling the eastern enclosure. And something in the arrangement of those facts made the thing in his chest constrict in a way that had nothing to do with the wolf's pain. She turned, saw him. For a moment, neither of them moved. She was standing with the wet linen still in her hands, water running from it onto the stone floor, and he was in the doorway in his council clothing, and the distance between them was perhaps 12 feet, and it was the first time they had been in the same room without gates or corridor length between them. The bond hit them both at the same moment. He had been aware of it building for 2 weeks. The directional pressure, the constant low register of her position in his awareness, the way his body processed her proximity differently from everything else. He had categorized it and managed it, and declined to follow any of its implications further than the first step. At 12 feet, with no barrier between them, it stopped being something he could manage by categorization. It arrived as warmth first. Not ambient, not the warmth of the room, but something that originated in the center of his chest and moved outward with a specificity that told him exactly where she was, even without looking, even if every lamp had gone out simultaneously. Underneath the warmth, something older, a pull with direction and weight. His wolf instinct, which ordinarily ran as background architecture beneath his rational mind, pushed forward through every layer he had arranged above it and pressed itself against the inside of his ribs and said, with a clarity that required no translation, "Here." Across the room, he watched something cross her face that she didn't entirely succeed in keeping off it. A startled quality, like a sound heard in an empty room. Her hands tightened on the wet linen. She blinked once, and then her expression returned to the careful neutral she kept on by habit, but it was a second slower than usual, and he noticed. He crossed the room. Not quickly, with the measured pace of someone who has made a decision and is following through on it without performance. "You were reassigned this morning," he said. "Yes, Your Majesty." "On whose authorization?" She held his gaze for a moment before answering. "A reallocation order. I was told it came through the steward." It didn't originate with the steward. He said it flatly, without making it a question, because he already knew the answer, and the reallocation document being brought to him at this moment by his guard in the corridor above would confirm it. "You're returning to the Eastern Wing." She looked at him, not the lowered gaze of standard court deference, but a direct look that assessed him with the same practical attention she gave everything, deciding whether the instruction was real, deciding whether it would hold. "The shift is permanent," he said. It came out with more weight than he intended. "I'll have the documentation recorded this time." Something moved in her green eyes. Not gratitude, something more careful than that. More measured. She nodded, set the linen down on the basin's edge, and dried her hands on her apron. He escorted her back through the palace himself. He told himself it was practical. Vile's state required immediate resolution, and the fastest way to achieve that was to move efficiently. He didn't examine the other reasons, and he didn't allow the bond's insistence to become visible in how he walked or spoke or held the space between them as they moved through the corridors. The palace noticed anyway. Servants pressed to walls as they passed. 2 junior council members encountered in the main passage managed their expressions with varying degrees of success. The head steward, appearing from a side corridor with a document in hand that Gideon recognized as the reallocation order, took one look at the two of them and made a decision not to speak. When they reached the Eastern Wing and Willa went through the outer door, Vile's sound dropped in register almost immediately. Within minutes, the structural assault on the gate had stopped. Through the bond, Gideon felt the shift in the wolf's state, the acute distress losing its edges, the pressure in his own chest easing with it, replaced by that quiet warmth that had become the bond's resting frequency over the past 2 weeks. He stood in the outer corridor and held the reallocation order and looked at the Lord Edric's signature at the bottom of it. The move had been deliberate. The lack of documentation on her initial reassignment had been the entry point, and Sybil or her father or both had found it and used it before he'd thought to close it. That was his error. The document was evidence of calculation, not impulse. Someone had been watching the Eastern Wing closely enough to identify the vulnerability. He sent for Corin. Sybil had come to the same conclusion before the afternoon was over. She had received the account from her household steward. The Alpha King had personally escorted the kitchen servant back through the palace from the lower level, in front of staff, without apparent concern for how it appeared. She sat with that information for a long time. The reallocation had been meant to create distance quietly. Instead, it had produced exactly the opposite. Gideon now visibly involved, the servant's position reinforced, and Sybil's own hand partially exposed to anyone paying attention. Her father would say she had moved too early. He would be correct, though she had no intention of telling him that. She could not remove the girl from the Eastern Wing directly. That had been demonstrated. But there were other ways to remove a person from a position they occupied, removing the ground beneath them rather than the person standing on it. She began that evening, during the household dinner, where she could speak freely with 3 of her father's allied council members, to construct a different kind of problem for the girl who had somehow managed to become one. It didn't require fabrication. It only required framing. The Alpha King spending unscheduled time in the Eastern Corridor. The undocumented reassignment of a wolfless human to exclusive care of a supernatural war animal. The animals marked behavioral change since her arrival, noted by multiple staff. An influence, she said carefully, that the council should perhaps examine, not as accusation, but as due diligence. An inquiry, framed as concern for the palace's stability rather than personal grievance. The council members listened. They were careful men, with careful habits. They would not act without evidence. But they would watch, and watching was its own kind of pressure. By the time she retired that evening, Sybil had the beginning of something she could build. Not a direct confrontation, something quieter and harder to defend against. A case, assembled over time from the materials already present, that would make the girl's position untenable without requiring Sybil to move anything directly. She was patient. She had always been patient. It was, her father had told her since childhood, the most important quality in a person who intended to win. She intended to win. The council session had been 3 days in the making. Willa didn't know that. She was in the Eastern Wing on the morning it convened, working through the feeding routine while Vile watched her from his usual position near the gate, his enormous head tracking her hands with the patient attention she had come to recognize as his resting state when she was present. Outside, the palace moved through its ordinary rhythms. She had no access to what was happening in the upper chambers, and nobody with access to the upper chambers had any reason to tell her. The session was framed as a review of palace administrative practices. Lord Edric had brought it to the council chair with the dry efficiency of a man presenting a ledger rather than an accusation, which was precisely why it landed the way it did. He had spent 2 weeks building a document. It was careful, thorough, and arranged to read as concern rather than attack. It cited, in sequence, the undocumented reassignment of a wolfless human servant to exclusive management of the war wolf. The Alpha King's repeated unscheduled presence in the Eastern Wing during her shift hours, observed and recorded by palace staff. The Alpha King's personal escort of the servant through the main palace corridors following the reallocation incident. The Warwolf's marked behavioral change attributed by multiple staff members to the servant's exclusive presence. The absence of any precedent in the documented history of the Warwolf binding for a human, wolfless, low-ranked, with no bloodline connection, producing that effect on the animal. The question he put to the council was not whether the king's conduct was improper. It was whether the council had an obligation to investigate what he termed an unnatural influence of unclear origin on both the Alpha King's warwolf and potentially the Alpha King himself. Gideon sat at the head of the long table and listened to the whole of it without interruption. The chamber, when Edric finished, was the specific quiet of a room in which everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. Gideon looked at the document Edric had placed before him. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. "The werewolf's behavior," he said finally, "has been stable for 3 weeks. The previous 3 months cost this palace 4 handlers and extensive structural repair to the eastern enclosure. The current arrangement is producing results that no other approach produced. The Council's concern about administrative documentation is noted and will be addressed." "The concern," Edric said, with the careful tone of a man who knew he was approaching a boundary, "extends beyond the documentation. I understand what the concern extends to." Gideon set his hands flat on the table. "And I understand where it originates." He didn't look toward Sybil's seat in the adjoining chamber where she had observer rights in council proceedings. He didn't need to. The inquiry is noted. The arrangement in the eastern wing remains in place. If the council wishes to formalize its concerns in writing, it may do so. He closed the session. Corin walked with him afterward down the upper corridor that ran along the outer wall, where the wind came through the unglazed openings and the sound of the lower courtyard drifted up. They walked in silence for a while, which was one of the things Gideon valued about Corin specifically. The man could maintain silence without filling it. "She needs to be told," Corin said finally. Gideon didn't answer. "Not for your sake, for hers." Corin stopped walking. Gideon continued 2 paces further before stopping as well. "She is operating without the information that defines the situation she's in. The council has put her name on a document. She doesn't know that. She doesn't know why the wolf behaves the way it does. She doesn't know what the bond's formation means for her specifically." He paused. "She is making decisions about her own circumstances without the facts that would govern those decisions. That is not a kindness toward her. That is a convenience for you." Gideon stood with his back to Corin for a moment, looking out through the opening at the lower courtyard below. "I'll tell her," he said. "When?" The word sat in the air. "When I have decided how to handle what comes after," Gideon said. He said it with the flat authority of a man accustomed to pronouncements that closed subjects. He resumed walking. Corin did not follow. He stood at the wall opening after the Alpha King had gone, with the wind moving through the passage and the sound of the courtyard below, and he made a decision. Gideon had given him the answer he was going to keep giving until the ceremony date was close enough that it stopped being possible to give it. Corin had served 3 Alpha Kings. He had watched one of them spend 4 years inside the slow erosion of an unacknowledged true mate bond. And he had watched what was left of the man at the end of it. And he had promised himself then that he would not stand aside and manage his own silence while it happened again if he could prevent it. He went to the eastern wing the following morning. He timed it for the middle of the shift, when Willa would be past the initial work of feeding and into the quieter portion. He knocked on the outer door with the particular cadence that distinguished a deliberate arrival from an administrative appearance, and when she opened it, steady, clear-eyed, faintly wary in the way she always was with anyone above her station who arrived unannounced, he asked if he could come in. She stepped back and let him enter. Viel raised his head from the far end of the enclosure. He looked at Corin with the flat assessment of an animal that had categorized every person in the palace and assigned them a level of significance. He looked at Willa beside Corin. He looked back at Corin, held the gaze for a moment that was slightly too long to be ordinary animal behavior, and put his head back down. Corin noted that. He noted everything. "I want to tell you something that the Alpha King has not told you," he said. "And I want to be direct with you about why I'm doing it, rather than him." He glanced at the wolf, then at her. "Will you hear me?" Willa's hands, he noticed, were very still at her sides. She was braced, in the way of someone who has learned that news delivered without preamble is rarely preferable to a long approach. "Yes," she said. He told her about the war wolf binding first, the actual history of it, not the version in the palace records, but the transmission through the beta line across 3 generations. The ancestral nature of it, the 2-directional connection between Viel and the bloodline, the way the wolf's instinct operated as an extension of the Alpha King's own animal nature made external and visible. He told her what Viel's recognition of a person meant in the accumulated understanding of every Beta advisor who had served an Alpha King with a Warwolf binding. She listened without interrupting. He had not expected her to interrupt. She had the quality of a person who gathers all available information before responding to any of it, which he respected, and which made the next part harder. The mate bond is already forming, he said. What you may have felt in the past 3 weeks, the awareness, the warmth, the sense of his position without looking, that is not incidental. That is the bond's early expression. It is real. It is not something either of you chose. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and direction, not emptiness, but the specific quality of a very large thing being absorbed in real time. He knows this, she said, not a question. He has known since shortly after your first shift here. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that he saw it. And the ceremony with Lady Sybil is in 6 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her arrive at the full dimensions of the situation the same way he'd watched her work through the enclosure on her first morning, methodically, without flinching at what she found. He had not misjudged her. You're telling me this without his knowledge, she said. Without his instruction. Not without his knowledge that I would eventually do so. Corin folded his hands together. He is a man who believes he can govern his way through this. I have seen that belief tested before in this bloodline. I prefer that you have the information, rather than be managed by its absence. She nodded once. It was not agreement so much as acknowledgement. She looked at Viel across the enclosure. The wolf was still down, his breathing slow and even, monitoring the conversation with one ear turned toward them without lifting his head. There is one more thing, Corin said. She looked back at him. He told her about Edric's document, the council session. Her name on a formal inquiry, the language Edric had used, unnatural influence, and what it was designed to produce. She needed to understand the full dimensions of what was being constructed around her, because a person making decisions about their own safety needed access to the full shape of what was being built around them, not a managed version of it. When he finished, she was looking at the floor between them. Not collapsed. Nothing about her posture suggested collapse. She was thinking. He recognized the quality of it now, had seen it enough in the past few weeks to know the difference between distress and the very rapid processing of difficult information. Thank you, she said. Her voice was level. For telling me. He left her there with the wolf and the lamplight and the weight of everything he'd placed in her hands, and he walked back through the eastern corridor with the even step of a man who had done what he believed was right and was prepared to live in the consequences of it. What happened in the days that followed, Corin learned only in pieces and only after. Willa continued her morning shifts without visible change. She was methodical. She was careful. She did not go to Gideon. She did not send a message. She asked Corin nothing further when she encountered him briefly in the main corridor 2 days after their conversation, only acknowledged him with the small nod she gave to people she had assessed and categorized as trustworthy, and continued past. She was also, those same days, developing a very clear picture of the Eastern Wing's supply routes. The palace received merchant deliveries twice a week through the service entrance on the northern side, a large double gate in the outer wall, used by the commercial supply wagons that came from the valley town a half-day's journey away. The wagons arrived before dawn and departed before the household fully woke. The gate was managed by 2 guards and a receiving steward and was one of 5 points where the outer wall could be crossed without passing through the main gatehouse. She had helped with receiving inventory twice in her years in the kitchen stores. She knew the names of 2 of the merchant drivers. She knew the route the wagons took back out through the lower north road, which ran along the forest line before turning toward the valley. She had no wolf senses, no shifted speed, no ability to track or be tracked through the bond the way Gideon could. What she had was a working knowledge of where people paid attention and where they didn't. Developed across most of her life as someone palace staff paid very little attention to at all. On the 5th night after Corin's visit, she placed her small bundle of possessions inside a laundry sack and carried it down to the storage corridor adjacent to the northern service gate before the wagons arrived. She waited in the dark behind a row of supply barrels cross-legged on the stone floor for 2 hours. She wasn't running away from the bond. She understood enough about the mate bond now to know that geography was likely not a functional barrier between two people connected by something ancestral and irreversible. But she was 20 years old, and she had no wolf and no family and no political standing. And Lord Edric had written her name on a formal council inquiry as a vector of unnatural influence. The ceremony with Lady Sybil was in 6 weeks. Whatever Gideon believed he could govern his way through, she was not willing to wait inside the palace walls and become the material from which someone built a case for her execution. She had a legitimate reason to leave. She intended to use it. The wagons came just before first light. She slipped in among the departing drivers in the dark, between two large covered loads, and walked through the northern service gate with her head down and her bundle on her shoulder, and the guards noted the merchant traffic and the ledger marks and did not note her specifically. She was across the outer wall before the sun cleared the horizon. Gideon felt it at the 3rd hour of his sleep. He came awake the way you come awake when something has changed structurally rather than in response to a sound. Fully, instantly, sitting upright in the dark, with his hands braced on the mattress and his pulse already running hard. For a moment, he didn't have a word for what was wrong. He only knew that something was wrong in a way that was distinct from every other night of the past weeks. Then it clarified. The bond's compass, the constant directional pressure that had located her within the palace for weeks, updating itself without effort, orienting him toward her presence with the quiet insistence of something operating beneath conscious thought, was pointing outward, through the wall, beyond the gate, and into the dark, beyond the palace's outer boundary, with a pull that had changed quality entirely, from the low, warm pressure of proximity to something that moved through his chest like a hand pressed against the inside of his ribs, pulling forward. She was gone. He was on his feet before the full fact of it had finished arriving. His body had already decided before his mind caught up. And the animal instinct driving it was not the measured alpha authority he governed from or the controlled restraint of the past weeks. It was something below all of that, older and less interested in political timelines, responding to the severing of proximity with a directness that had no patience for strategy. He stopped himself at the door of his chambers, stood there with one hand on the frame, and his breathing running hard and the bond's pull pressing forward through his chest, insistently. She had left. She had made a choice. She had the full information. Corin had confirmed that 2 days ago, with the careful neutrality of a man who had done something and was presenting the evidence of it without flinching. And she had used that information to make a decision about her own circumstances, which was exactly what Corin had argued she deserved the ability to do. He could not follow her tonight. Not in the state he was in, with the animal instinct pushing through every layer of control he had built across years in this position. Not without making it something that looked like exactly what Edric's document accused it of being. The Alpha King, unable to govern his own behavior, pursuing a wolfless kitchen servant through the night because a supernatural bond told him to. He went back into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed with his forearms on his knees and his head down, and he held the position with the deliberate effort of a man physically restraining something that did not want to be restrained. The bond pulled, steady, directional, insistent, pointing north from somewhere in the eastern wing, muffled by distance and stone but unmistakable. Vial's howl began, long and sustained, and carrying a quality that moved through the palace's structure and arrived through the walls as vibration as much as sound. It went on for a long time. It did not stop before Gideon had finally, with great effort, lain back down and fixed his gaze on the ceiling in the dark. He did not sleep. He remained awake in the dark and felt the bond's pull with each breath and listened to Vial's howl work its way through the stone walls of the palace. And he thought with great precision about everything he had told himself over the past 3 weeks, and about the distance between those certainties and the present moment, and what the gap between them required him to do next. In the morning, he would follow. Not tonight, with the animal instinct driving him. In the morning, with clear eyes and a direction and the full understanding of what he was choosing and why. He watched the ceiling until the pale gray of early dawn began to show at the window edge. Vial howled until the sky changed. He left at first light. No escort, no guard detail. Corin met him in the lower stable corridor as he was saddling his own horse, which was the kind of thing that made the stable hand step back and find tasks in other parts of the building. The Alpha King did not typically saddle his own horse, and when he did, it meant the morning was not ordinary. Corin stood with his hands folded and watched him work and said nothing for a moment. "She went north," Gideon said, not looking up from the buckle. "I know. The bond puts her at least a full day's ride out, probably more." He checked the girth strap and moved to the bridle. "I need you to stay." Corin nodded. That had been his intention. He had spent the night in his own chambers making a different kind of calculation, reviewing the council document, the language of it, the specific legal framing Edric had used. He had been turning it over since Gideon had told him about the session, and something in the architecture of it had been troubling him in a way he hadn't yet been able to name precisely. "There is something wrong with the document," Corin said. Gideon paused, looked at him over the horse's neck. "The framing is too specific." Corin chose his words with the care of someone presenting a half-formed conclusion rather than a finished one. Edric cited unnatural influence as the concern. But the legal precedent he invoked to justify a formal inquiry, the mechanism he used to give the council the authority to investigate, applies specifically to agents of foreign pacts. Not to palace staff with behavioral anomalies, not to wolfless humans. It is the wrong legal instrument for the stated concern. He held Gideon's gaze. Unless the stated concern is not the actual concern, unless the document is building toward an accusation that hasn't been made yet. Gideon's hands had gone still on the bridle. "An agent of a foreign pack," he said, "sent deliberately to destabilize the Alpha King through the War Wolf." Corin's voice was even. "It would require documentation to support the claim. Prior correspondence, perhaps. Evidence of contact with a rival bloodline. The kind of material that could be assembled if someone had the resources and the motivation and the access to the kind of seals that make documents appear legitimate." The stable was very quiet. "Find it," Gideon said. He finished the bridle and moved to his horse's head. "Whatever they've built or are building, find it before I return." "Yes." He mounted and left through the northern gate at a pace that made the gate guards step aside without ceremony, and Corin stood in the empty stable corridor and listened to the hoofbeats fade into the morning, and then went to do what he had spent the night preparing to do. The bond was not a map. That was the first thing Gideon had to accept as the morning became midday, and midday became the long, pale afternoon of early autumn. It did not give him a road or a direction indicator or a distance with any precision. What it gave him was the same thing it had given him for 3 weeks inside the palace. A directional pressure in his chest, a weighted pull that updated itself as he moved, sharpening when he was on the right heading and dulling almost imperceptibly when he deviated. Following it required the particular attention of listening to something that spoke below the level of language, the way you follow the sound of water through dense trees by feeling when it gets louder rather than hearing a clear source. He rode north along the main road until the bond's pull shifted slightly west, and then he followed a tributary track through farmland and then forest, and by late afternoon, the pull had developed a specificity that told him she was close. Not the broad awareness of palace distances. Something with resolution, a tightening, a warmth with a point of origin rather than a general temperature. The village appeared through the tree line as the sun was dropping toward the ridge. It was small, built around a crossroads market that served the valley farms, a scattering of buildings in weathered timber and stone, a well in the central square, smoke from several chimneys. The kind of settlement that existed in the spaces between larger places, useful and functional and entirely uninterested in being notable. He slowed his horse at the tree line and let the bond orient him before he entered. The pull pointed toward the eastern side of the market square, toward a long, low building that was either a wayfarer's house or a storage facility for market goods. It was a wayfarer's house. He knew before he dismounted because he could feel her inside it. He tied his horse at the post outside and stood for a moment in the cooling evening air. He had been riding for most of a day, and the distance had done something useful to the animal urgency that had driven him out of bed at first light. Not extinguished it, but settled it back below the level where it governed. He was himself again. That mattered for what came next. He went inside. She was in the back room, which the wayfarer's housekeeper pointed him toward with the particular unquestioning cooperation that Alpha authority produced in people who couldn't identify why they felt disinclined to ask questions. She was sitting on a low bench against the far wall with her bundle beside her and a cup of something cooling in her hands, and she looked up when he came through the door with the expression of someone who is not entirely surprised, but had hoped, perhaps, for a little more time. "How?" she said. He crossed the room and sat down on the bench across from her, which was a deliberate choice, across, not beside, not standing over her. He set his forearms on his knees and looked at her directly. "The bond," he said. "It functions as direction. Not perfectly. It took most of the day." She absorbed that. Set the cup down on the floor beside her. She had a cut on her right hand, recent, probably from the journey. A branch or a stone, something from traveling in the dark through the Northern Roads forest section. He noticed it with the same quality of attention that noticed everything about her. The specificity of it lodged sideways in his chest. "I know about the document," she said. "Not just the council inquiry, the other thing they're building." He looked at her. "Corin told me about the formal inquiry," she said. "But I spent the days after working through what you'd told me in pieces and what Corin told me, and the specific way Edric framed the concern. I have spent enough years around inventories, steward ledgers, and the kinds of orders that move through a palace to know when a document's language is reaching for something larger than what it claims to address. I know what accusation it's laying the groundwork for." Her voice was level and clear with the quality of someone who has rehearsed this because they needed to be clear rather than because they planned a performance. "They're going to make me a foreign agent. Plant documentation of contact with a rival pack. Have me executed for it." He said nothing. "You knew about Sybil's involvement in the reallocation order before I did," she continued. "You knew about the inquiry, and you did not tell me." Her green eyes held his without deflection. "I need you to tell me what else you knew and did not tell me, because I need to understand the shape of what I walked into." It was a fair demand. He recognized it as such, which meant he had to sit with the fact that the answer was not one he could give without exposing the calculation he had been making. "I knew the inquiry was coming," he said. "I knew Edric was building a case. I did not know the specific instrument he intended to use or the accusation it was designed to support." He held her gaze. "I knew the situation you were in was becoming dangerous, and I told myself I would resolve it before it reached you directly. I did not tell you because I was still determining how to navigate the ceremony arrangements, and I preferred to manage the variables before presenting them." The silence that followed had a particular quality. "I was a variable," she said. "No." The word came out before the thought was fully formed, and it arrived with more force than he had intended. He steadied. "You were not a variable. The politics surrounding you were variables. The distinction matters to me, and I understand why it may not matter to you, and you're entitled to that." She looked at him for a long moment, assessing, the same practical evaluation she gave everything that he had come to recognize as the way she moved through the world. "The ceremony with Lady Sybil," she said, "will not take place." She blinked. "Once. When did you decide that?" "Somewhere between the laundry stores and 3 weeks of finding reasons to appear in the Eastern Wing every morning and calling it administrative oversight." Something in his voice went dry. "The decision was made some time ago. I was taking longer than I should have to act on it. Because of the council." "Because of the council, yes. And because the mate bond forming between two people without their knowledge or consent is a more significant fact than I was treating it as, and I was handling it like a problem to be managed, rather than a reality both of us deserve to have named directly." He said it plainly, without performance. It was not comfortable to say. He said it anyway. "I should have told you earlier. That is not something I can correct now, but I can tell you it clearly." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the wayfarer's house, the village evening sounds continued. Someone calling across the square, a cart on the road, the ordinary texture of a place that had no awareness of what was being resolved in its back room. "What happens when we go back?" she said. "Corin is working on the forgery evidence now. If it exists, and I believe it does, it will be presented to the council before we return. Edric's position on the council depends on credibility that will not survive documentation of a fabricated treason charge." He kept his voice even. The political fallout from that will be real and will take time. It will not be resolved by a single session. There are council members who aligned with Edric's position who will need to be addressed separately. That process will be complicated. And my position. He looked at her steadily. Complicated. Genuinely and without easy resolution. You are human and wolfless, and there is no precedent in recent memory for a true mate bond between an Alpha King and a human servant. The Council will have objections. Some of them will be legitimate concerns about bloodline and succession. Those will have to be navigated over time. He did not dress it differently than it was. I am telling you that as fact, not as a warning against coming back. You should know the actual terrain. She almost smiled. It was a small thing at the corner of her mouth, there and then managed back into the careful neutral. Corin said the same thing, about deserving the full shape of it. Corin is correct about most things. It is occasionally irritating. This time the smile reached more of her face. Brief, real, and gone again. She looked down at her hands, at the cut he had noticed, the calloused palms, the practical evidence of years of work done without ceremony. He looked at them too. I didn't leave because of the bond, she said quietly. I want that to be clear. I left because I had calculated that staying increased the probability of dying, and I had no guarantee that anyone with the authority to prevent that was going to act in time. I know. I need you to know that I would have made the same choice again with the same information. I know that too. He meant it. It was a rational decision made by someone who had been given insufficient information to make a safer one. The deficit was mine. She was quiet for a moment. Then, the bond, what I've been feeling, the awareness of where you are, the warmth. Is that permanent now? The recognition is permanent. The bond's full expression depends on whether it's completed. And if it isn't, he considered how to say the next part with accuracy rather than pressure. The war-wolf binding is tied to my bloodline's instinct. Vile's recognition and the bond forming are not separable from each other or from me. If the bond isn't completed, Vile's state is likely to return to what it was for those 3 months. And the physiological cost to me of an uncompleted bond over time is, he paused, significant. I'm not asking because I'm looking for a reason not to, she said. I'm asking because I want to understand what is real. I know, he said. And then, because she deserved precision. What is real is that the bond forming between us is genuine and not manufactured by either of us and not the result of anything you did or intended. What is real is that I would not be in this wayfarer's house if I had any remaining uncertainty about what I want. And what is real is that nothing that follows from tonight depends on your fear of consequences to me. I need you to believe that, because it is true. She held his gaze for a long, careful moment. Then she said, All right. It was not a declaration. It was a considered word from a woman who chose her words with the same care she chose everything, and it carried the weight of that consideration fully. He understood it exactly for what it was. They rode back to the palace the following morning. Not quickly. The bond's pull was different now, settled, oriented, no longer the urgent forward pressure of distance. It had become something he was aware of the way you are aware of your own heartbeat. Constant, specific, entirely integrated into the background architecture of himself. He noticed it most when she was within arm's reach, which for a full day's ride was almost continuous, and which produced a quality of steadiness he didn't immediately have a name for. She noticed the bond on the road, too. He could tell without her saying it. The occasional micro-adjustments, the way her attention oriented toward him in the same moment his oriented toward her. The small, precise synchronization of two people whose nervous systems had decided to treat each other as relevant without asking for approval. She didn't comment on it. He didn't either. It was simply present, building itself in the ordinary hours of a ride through autumn farmland and forest, unhurried and thorough. Corin met them at the northern gate. He had the look of a man who had not slept and considered it well spent. He carried a leather document folio and handed it to Gideon before either of them had dismounted, which communicated the urgency efficiently. 3 documents, Corin said, walking alongside as they moved into the courtyard. 2 forged under the seal of the Draveth bloodline, A northern pack with a genuine political grievance against this throne, which is why they were chosen. The grievance is real, even if the correspondence isn't. One internal document from Edric's own records that should not exist, establishing a timeline of contact that predates Willa's assignment to the Eastern Kennels by 4 months. Someone was very thorough. He paused. Perhaps too thorough. The seal on the second Draveth document has a flaw that doesn't appear on any authentic Draveth correspondence in the archive. I found 3 examples of authentic seals for comparison. The flaw is consistent and reproducible, which means it came from a copy of the seal rather than the original. A copy in whose possession, Gideon said. That is the question I put to Edric's personal secretary this morning, Corin said, after I had the secretary's door blocked by 2 guards and made clear that cooperation was the variable that determined the shape of the next several years of his life. He allowed himself the smallest evidence of satisfaction. Edric commissioned the seal copy 11 months ago, before the mate bond, before the war wolf's disturbance. Not for this exact chain of events, for a contingency he had not yet attached to a name. It was prepared and held in reserve. Gideon had gone very still. He planned for the possibility, Corin said, not this precise arrangement of people and timing. The possibility of needing a foreign contact case ready for whatever disruption might threaten succession or council balance. The war wolf binding's mate recognition had been documented in beta records he had partial access to through an old family connection. He looked at Gideon steadily. He was ready. He had the materials. He simply needed an opening. Willa had been listening from 2 steps behind. Gideon looked back at her. Her face was composed, but her hands had tightened on her horse's rein. He'll be brought before the council this afternoon, Gideon said. To Corin, but loud enough. Full presentation of the forgery evidence. I want 3 independent archivists to verify the seal flaw before the session opens. The secretary's testimony in writing before midday. Already in progress, Corin said. The council session that afternoon was the kind that rewrote the following months of a court's functioning. Edric's removal from the council was not immediate. There was process, because process was what separated governance from violence, and Gideon had always believed that. But the presentation of the forgery evidence before a full council with 3 archivists confirming the seal flaw and the secretary's written testimony, establishing the timeline, produced a silence in the chamber of the specific kind that means something has become indefensible. Sybil's formal connection to the framing scheme could not be established from the documents alone. What could be established was her father's preparation of materials designed to have Willa executed. The betrothal agreement's dissolution was placed on the council record that same evening, with the political implications distributed to the relevant noble houses through formal correspondence. Edric's allied council members would need to be addressed individually. That process would take weeks. Sybil's observer privileges were suspended pending review, and she was instructed to withdraw from council-adjacent proceedings until Edric's case was fully examined. It was not framed as punishment. It was framed as procedural distance. In court terms, the distinction mattered. In practice, it left her politically isolated in the very hours when isolation carried the most weight. It was not clean. It was not resolved. Gideon had told Willa the shape of it, and he had been accurate. What happened in the Eastern Wing that evening was not a political event. Gideon had given instructions that the enclosure be opened, the outer door left unlatched, and the gate drawn back, which had not been done since Vale's 3 months of rage began. He went alone. The enclosure was lit by the last of the day's light through the high vents, amber and low, catching the scored marks on the floor and the patched gate hardware and the clean water in the trough. Vael was standing in the center of the enclosure when he entered, not pacing, standing with the weight of something that had been waiting and had now stopped waiting. Those silver-edged eyes found Gideon immediately and held him with the quality of attention that was more than animal. The living instinct of his own bloodline made external, looking back at him. Willa came in behind him. Vael's gaze moved to her. Something moved through the wolf's enormous body. Not aggression, not hunger, not the coiled energy of the first morning. Something that expressed itself in the way a body expresses relief when it has been braced for a long time and has finally been told it can stop. He stepped toward her, unhurried and certain, and pressed the broad flat of his head against her palm. The bond between Gideon and the wolf moved with it, a current through the connection, warm and specific. He felt it in his own chest with the fullness of something completed rather than approached. Willa's hand moved over Viel's head. She was looking at the wolf, but after a moment she looked up at Gideon across the space between them, and the bond, both bonds, the one to the wolf and the one forming between them, sharing the same origin in the bloodline's ancestral depth, was fully present and fully visible in the quality of that look. "All right," she said. The same word as the wayfarer's house, the same weight behind it. He crossed the enclosure. The claiming was not a political arrangement or a ceremony or a resolution of variables. It was two people who had arrived at the same place through different routes, with full information and no managed ignorance between them, making a choice that the bond had been preparing the ground for, since the first morning she had pressed her palm to an iron gate, and a wolf had gone still. Viel lay down on the stone floor with his great head on his forepaws and his eyes half closed. He did not make a sound. For the first time since midsummer, the eastern wing of the palace was completely, entirely quiet. The silence had a quality that was different from the absence of noise. It had warmth in it. It had the texture of something that had found its shape after a long time of looking. Outside, the palace continued. The council records would be updated. The noble houses would receive their correspondence. The weeks ahead would carry the complicated weight of everything that had been built around them, and would now have to be dismantled carefully and replaced with something new. None of that was resolved tonight. What was resolved was the thing that had been building since a wolfless kitchen servant walked into an enclosure before dawn with a lamp and a feed bucket, and a wolf that had been destroying everything within reach had pressed his nose through an iron gate and gone still. Gideon stood in the lamplight of the eastern enclosure, with the bond settled in his chest, like something that had always been there and had only just come home, and he thought that some things could not be governed or managed or navigated. Some things simply were.